If you're building an AI drug discovery company right now, the bottleneck between you and being taken seriously by big pharma isn't your model, your compute, or your benchmarks. It's whether a molecule your platform designed actually shows activity in real patients in a real phase 1 trial. Today's guest is one of the few people in AI native biotech who can credibly say his platform has cleared that bar with monotherapy clinical responses. Iambic Therapeutics is a clinical stage company building an AI-driven drug discovery platform that fuses physics-based modeling with generative AI. Iambic has raised approximately $320 million across 5 rounds. My guest today, Tom Miller, co-founded Iambic in 2020 and has served as CEO since inception. Before founding Iambic, Tom spent over a decade as a tenured professor at Caltech, publishing more than 140 peer-reviewed articles and patents. Tom, it's amazing to have you on here, so thank you for being here today.
It's a pleasure, Vic. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I wanted to go right into it, and I think Iambic is a market leader in kind of AI for drug discovery. And that's a big thesis that's been going on for like a decade plus. I mean, ever since the concept of AI became a thing, drug discovery was one of the biggest concepts here. What kind of specifically changed, I guess, in the last couple years that made this space much more attractive, whether that be to founders or investors? And that could be in potential different opportunities like model, the data, the compute. Like, what specifically kind of got this, I guess, field to a much better light, I guess?
I do think it has been a field that's held a lot of promise for a long time, and a lot of people have been working towards the useful application of AI in drug discovery. I mean, the reality is that drug discovery is very hard. Making drugs is hard to do successfully, and AI isn't magic, even as it improves as quickly as we currently are seeing. So I think that the rising tide of improved AI methods and expanded data sets is valuable. The rise of automation is tremendously valuable, but there's no substitution for the meaningful integration of those with deep drug discovery experience and commitment.
I mean, I think that's something that's very interesting. I mean, what kind of, I guess, got you very interested in AI for drug development? Because I think Iambic is very interesting, where it's not a
Well,
pure biotech company. You guys are developing AI native tools that help accelerate your scientists much more easier. Why did you kind of decide to take that approach versus just going straight into deep tech building?
no, I think that's a great question. I mean, looking at my own career as an academic, I was not a, drug discovery focused academic at Caltech for the
Yeah.
decade plus that I was there. I worked broadly across a lot of different application areas, worked on batteries, worked on catalysts, worked on all sorts of different things. And Iambic was originally founded with more of the idea that you're saying, more of a software play, more of
Right.
the sense that it would be broadly useful for just predicting the properties of molecules and that kind of thing. And we quickly realized, to answer your question, we quickly realized that if you want to participate in a market, you have to make the product associated with that market, right? If you want
Yeah.
to participate in the drug discovery industry, it's far more valuable and far more impactful to put your money where your mouth is. Use those great tools and make that product. And that product in this situation is novel drugs.
Yeah, I mean, you guys kind of started before ChatGPT kind of came out. I mean, without that AI moment and around 2020, what was the, I guess, the contrarian bets that you were thinking? And when you were kind of spreading out what Iambic was, the scientists at that time, what were the common, I guess, disagree points that they were like, okay, this is definitely not going to work, or this is not going to work at that time?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we first started, again, I was an academic. I did
Right.
not have a deep drug development track record. And I think the expectation and definitely the trend among other AI focused drug discovery companies at that time were just to effectively be service providers. Do a partnership with pharma. Use your tool as a point solution to help them in their drug discovery process, and they're going to do the heavy lifting of actually making the drugs and actually taking into clinic. So our contrarian bet was that we can do those things. We can build that extraordinary team to take it into clinic. We can make sure that we have that great drug discovery team and chemistry and biology team to choose the right targets and to create a really differentiated best in class or first in class molecule and really do it ourselves, made better by the AI platform technologies. So that was definitely a bet on our ability to grow into this space, which requires a lot of deep domain experience.
I think that's completely very true. And if you were kind of advising many biotech startups now, like what are those kind of contrarian bets that you're potentially seeing in the market that you probably didn't see last year and then kind of like moving forward now?
Think the point is don't look for a cheap win. I think that's my advice. You have to make sure that if you are creating something, there's a real market for it. And anything that is easy will be commoditized and done by a lot of other people. So you better have something you can do really well that is unique. And you should take a longer time horizon, I would say, or, expect to have to work hard in terms of actually taking that differentiation and making it matter for the real business driver of whatever industry that you're focusing on. That would be my advice.
That's a really interesting point that you brought up because I think a lot of, I guess, scientists that are in the lab that are looking to like break into the startup world don't really know where to start. Should they continue with, going with that postdoc training or becoming an official scientist, or should they kind of take what they're building, or maybe they have a novel idea that they're thinking? What are those kind of perfect first steps to think about? Should I, spin this out into a company, or should I just continue this as a project? Like, what are those kind of key moments to that kind of spark for Iambic?
That's a great question. And it's kind of a personal question, right? It depends upon how ready you are to take that entrepreneurial leap as an individual. I think it comes down to whether or not you have a great idea and you think that that great idea can be framed in terms of a meaningful inflection point.
Hmm.
If I build a team around this, if I take some VC capital around this, can I identify somewhere that could be on pathway for real demonstrable progress? And do I want to put my nose to the grindstone and try to do that? So I think once you kind of get to that point where you're willing to bet on what chapter two looks like, and you think that chapter two has a natural entree to three and four, then it might be time to go for it.
Is there a primary kind of, I guess, data mode? Like if I was a scientist thinking about this and I'm like, I want to talk to as many people as I can to learn if this is something I could take. Is there a big concept of like making or scaling partnerships that other people potentially won't can't get? Or is it getting very commoditized with the amount of, scalability and I guess partnership kind of driven kind of things that you can do overall?
I think it comes down to what you want the ultimate endpoint to be. If
Okay.
you're working in an industry where a SaaS model can genuinely scale to, a full-blown successful large company, then focusing on partnerships as the mechanism to, as a way to realize that SaaS business model makes a lot of sense. If you're in an industry where the partnerships will not necessarily be able to scale and sustain the ongoing growth of the company, well, then partnerships are kind of an ends to a means, or they're an initial validation. And then you have to be thoughtful about whether or not you're doing partnerships that are on path for what you're ultimately trying to build. But I guess that's kind of the point. You need to always try to have a clear sense of what you're ultimately trying to build, because then you'll have more of a sense of whether or not any given choice along the way is on pathway or off pathway for that particular goal.
One of the biggest things in AI and LMs, and more specifically in biology, is the concept of scaling laws. And scaling laws overall have been heavily debated, especially as I mentioned in biology, as be not we're not really working well or working well. What have you seen so far in your studies at Iambic that shows about LLMs, specifically in scaling laws?
Yeah, one thing that we have seen, well, I can tell you what we've seen in the context of the Enchant
Yeah.
large language model that is one of our flagship capabilities at Iambic. So Enchant allows us to predict flexibly across preclinical and clinical properties, and we use it for literally hundreds of distinct prediction endpoints within our drug discovery programs at Iambic. And we have gone through a series of prediction of model sizes with version 1 disclosed about 2 years ago, version 2 disclosed about a year ago, and with version 3 anticipated in the relatively near term. And with each increasing size of the model, we can basically monitor the scaling properties. We've gone over multiple orders of magnitude, and we can basically point to the corresponding scaling and the prediction properties. And the short answer there is that it really does show rigorous scaling behavior. We have shown that, in fact, in terms of white papers that we've already published, and I believe that one can expect that to continue for some increased period.
So what have, I guess, the white papers really shown in the scaling laws, more specifically, that kind of gave you confidence that this is something that's we're moving towards the, or we already in the direction where scaling laws are continuing?
Oh, I mean, what we do is we have various model sizes when you kind of train, what will ultimately be the final version 2, say. Then you have many intermediate model sizes that are smaller. You can do ablation studies. You can do all sorts of different things to take, smaller data sets and smaller model sizes along the way. And through the course of that, we're able to, get a significant number of intermediate points that allow us to probe the degree to which we're seeing the expected scaling behavior. And that is the finding.
And I was very curious about this, and I was thinking about this just recently. Is that I see a lot of, I guess, impressive benchmarks coming from a lot of bio foundation models out there. I mean, we see amazing benchmarks, but I always get curious how real it is when it comes to deployment. Like, is this something that's actually going to work in the real life scenarios? And I am at Iambic, you guys have shown that. What kind of advice can you give to, like, founders that are building in this space and seeing that high benchmarks and kind of thinking that this is something that I can't do? How can people kind of guide towards that?
I think to answer that question, the answer is to really test whether or not you're applying it in, the fires of a real world example. You're absolutely right. There's tremendous amount of good science that's going on in many different groups. And there are exciting algorithmic advances which lead to high watermarks on benchmarks. And it's almost like one axis of success, right?
Yeah.
But there is a different axis, which is the degree to which any tool can be deployed robustly, presented in a way that usefully changes decision making. And that's kind of just a complementary set of issues with any technology. So by using the tools in practice, and that can be in your own hands, that could be with a tight collaboration with somebody else, you really get to probe both sides of that to know whether or not the complete package is moving the needle for the things that really matter.
Yeah. So what is that gap look like between academically very interesting benchmark models and the ones that are actually moving, like, the drug discovery program forward?
That will be case dependent.
Mm.
It will depend on the technology. It will depend on the application domain. I think it will be case dependent. In our own experiences, Iambic was even first founded on, prediction endpoints, such as the strength of chemical bonds and specific molecular interactions and conformational energies, all of which are important,
Yeah.
which weren't really the thing that was gating between us and getting, a drug into clinic. So by really testing that, really finding what the actual pain points are in drug discovery for us, we found that not only did the algorithms have to change, they had to make sure that they were predicting the things that were the real blockers and that they were being presented in a way that allowed for a medicinal chemist or a biologist to make a better decision and therefore to dramatically accelerate or improve the odds of success.
Interesting. So when it comes to maybe potentially building another, I guess, another foundation model, or if another company's thinking about building that, I mean, that can be for protein, cells, tissues, or as you mentioned, how Iambic did it with clinical endpoints. What are those kind of, I guess, underrated inputs that determine whether the model is useful, not useful, and how can we kind of characterize that potentially?
I think that, well, I can tell you, how Iambic thinks about this.
Yeah.
Iambic is very focused on delivering best in class and first in class models to clinic. This is what we want to do. And we want to succeed not only in terms of getting to clinic, but we want to succeed in terms of getting through clinic successfully as well with successful clinical progress. So, there are just in any given choice of programs, there will be, 40 or so properties that you have to simultaneously get right. You have to make sure that, you're hitting the target you want. You have to make sure you're avoiding the off targets. It has to have the right clearance properties. It has to get to the right tissue, et cetera, et cetera. And then once you're in clinic, you have the corresponding properties not only for for animal models, but then you would have the corresponding properties for human beings, which will dictate, which patients to take the drug to and that kind of thing.
Interesting.
So so that's a huge array of things. And, you have to fold those into a collective metric
Mm,
that dictates whether or not I should work on this chemical series or that one to try to
mm.
get to clinic. So really making sure that you can connect the predictions with the decision making process that ultimately leads to the advancement of a drug.
Interesting. That's yeah. So at that specifically, I mean, kind of going into like how, Iambic specifically kind of designed these AI more specific molecules. You reported, I guess, in 2025 about the phase one, I guess, or 1B data, kind of showing about the pre-treated patients across the HER2 simplified, overexpressed, and mutant tumors. What kind of moment specifically, I guess, internally with your team, did you realize that this molecule actually worked in humans? And when you kind of figured that out, what was the process like, kind of going towards more kind of building more molecules and thinking about how this can work for the things coming up?
That was, of course, that was a very exciting moment for the team.
Yeah.
You know, HER2, it's a reasonably established target. That doesn't mean it's an easy target. You have to be able to achieve activity on HER2 while avoiding off target EGFR, which leads to dose limiting side effects. So that was one major challenge, getting a selectivity level that was unprecedented. And you have to get it into the brain because patients with that sort of cancer, 40% plus, will develop brain tumors and that will drive their morbidity. So there were things that made that target really very difficult. On the other hand, it is a target for which the biology is well established. So what we were able to do was to design a molecule with brain penetrance, with that selectivity, and on a target where we knew that if we could achieve those, improved features, it would likely translate to patients. All to say, it gave us a pretty early opportunity to have confidence in the success of the drug. There are other targets where the biology is much more mysterious that you would have to kind of, have a much later stage body of data to have confidence in that. So we were able to get that confidence very early with that drug.
And what was the process once you got that confidence with that drug? What was the process of kind of getting it to the next milestone? Ultimately, seeing the patient results and patient data. How long did that take? And I'm assuming, obviously, because they're still in that process. What are you guys kind of seeing overall with patient satisfaction rates and things like that?
We're very excited. What we were able to show, and this is much faster than industry norms. We were able to show in 3.5 years from the start of the program to proof of concept data at a major conference. So that goes all the way through the discovery process, all the
Mm.
way through getting it into clinic, all the way through running the dose escalation and getting the body of clinical data, then, getting it into the conference, doing all of that in 3.5 years, where you can compare that to the industry average of just getting to clinic in the first place is roughly twice that long at 6 years.
Yeah.
So we were able to do that very quickly. And what we were able to show is that the drug had very broad activity. We showed responses in, I think, five or six different tumor types: ovarian, lung, breast, gastric, many different types of cancer that were associated with HER2. We were able to show intracranial activity and we were able to show that it was really well tolerated. So it didn't have the sort of side effects that other drugs in this space have. So that was all very exciting for that first tranche of data that we were able to present last year at the ESMO conference in Berlin. We, do anticipate to present additional data. That the trials are very much active and
Mhm.
ongoing. And We anticipate to present additional data, and we're very excited about the continued success of the drug.
Yeah, that's really exciting to see, especially when it comes to that specific HER2s in general, and that's such a popular kind of genetic kind of mutation that kind of
Yeah, it's very common.
I mean, what was your take kind of like getting into, working with her too at first? Like what drove you to kind of like start looking into that and specifically and what kind of I guess kind of gave you the drive to continue with that?
Just to make sure I understand the question, it was around the selection of the target, the HER2
Yeah,
target?
selection
What
of
gave
the
us
target. Yeah, because I was gonna yeah, selection of the target.
Uh, the thing that drove us to the HER2 target was a very pronounced unmet need of patients.
Mm.
HER2 drugs have been developed for a long time, and there are some very effective ones that are appearing. However, patients inevitably progress on those. They are not cured, and therefore they need additional medicines in their journey to continue extending, healthy and good quality of life. So there was a real unmet need there, and in particular, helping patients to address the emergence of tumors in the brain, which appear in over 40% of breast and lung cancer patients with HER2 driven cancers. So, really seeking to address that huge unmet need was a major driver.
Interesting. So you mentioned how it took around 3 years to get this specific milestone completed versus someone else taking around maybe 8 years. Did your AI tools like Enchant really help out in this case specifically, and the follow-on tools that you've used or you've built, and that could have been a driving factor? Like, what is your hypothesis of making this so rapid?
We can definitely point to clear lines in terms of the way in which we did discovery on the platform and the resulting efficiency and speed with which we were able to get that drug to clinic. Enchant was actually in a preceding version at that time, but we had a similar unique in-house tool that allowed us to predict across the different properties that were of interest to greatly narrow the search space for finding the molecule that we wanted and to very efficiently allow us to identify the molecule in roughly 7 months that would ultimately become our clinical candidate. So it was a very fast search process, and the platform driven by the AI technologies were central to that.
Interesting. So kind of going into like, true bottlenecks, I guess, in science right now, everyone is pretty much, I guess, outside of biotech things, or not outside of deep tech kind of things. In AI drug discovery, I guess the AI is the hardest part. Everyone is building an AI, especially in deep tech, biotech. What are the two or three bottlenecks that are actually rate limiting today when it comes to like, and that could be more compute for example. But like, what are those kind of rate limiting factors when it comes to building better models and potentially driving and accelerating science much more easily?
I think that we're increasingly in an environment where building AI tools is not a rate limiting process. Everybody uses ChatGPT, uses Claude, uses all these different capabilities to, spin up, on demand predictive capabilities. So I think that in some ways, yes, compute will be a major factor for creating really large foundation models. But, the ability to create AI technologies is only getting easier, I would say. I think what is really the bottleneck is making sure that those tools are actually integrated with the creation of experimental data. It's one thing to be able to spit out a bunch of predictions and then maybe, you know, you can send that off to a lab somewhere and hopefully in 6 months you're going to get, your answers back and that kind of thing. But that's a would make for a very slow discovery process. At Iambic, we not only develop the AI technologies, but we tightly integrate that with an engine for data creation so that we can, on Monday, design which molecules we want to make. On Tuesday, we can turn those into chemical reality through our plate based synthesis. And then by later in the week, we can be doing the biological experiments that allow us to ultimately gather the data for the next iteration cycle. And we do that on a weekly cadence at Iambic, which really is, a tight integration of AI technology as well as physical robotic technology for the chemical and biological process.
Very interesting. And in that specifically, I think there was a big debate, and I'm sure it's still happening now about synthetic data and having that being used at first, and then kind of going into more human data or animal data. What's your thoughts on using synthetic data more for these AI models, and is that something that you use at Iambic as well at the beginning, and then obviously as you got more data, it became more kind of intuitive. Like, what is your take on that?
I come from a quantum chemistry background, a quantum mechanics background. So computed data is something that I am very enthusiastic about and very, familiar with.
Yeah, I bet. And one thing where I guess humans are still in the loop for is selecting targets. Target selection is such a huge component of, and a lot of AI. You got, as you mentioned, you've built AI to kind of help make that much more easier. Will we get to a point where AI will eventually kind of officially crack that target ID at scale, or will it still be a permanent human problem that will persist and it's going to be really hard for AI to come into that place overall?
I think when you're dealing with any kind of AI prediction, you have to ask yourself, how long does it take to validate that prediction? Right.
Yeah.
So, are we going to arrive at a state where an AI model can scan through, a large number of potential targets and prioritize the three that might be most relevant for a given disease? Yeah, we're going to get to that point. Could I then turn that into cellular experiments very quickly that are then going to help me to take a first step towards validating that? Sure, I can do that very quickly. But the reality is, you know, to have clinical validation means that you will have gotten to the point of actually, testing that hypothesis in human beings. And that is and there are many examples of targets that looked great at the, bioinformatic level or that looked great at the cellular level,
Yeah.
but because of the unique nature of human biology, ultimately proved to not be actionable targets. So I think as we hold ourselves to the challenge of finding novel targets, we should do that kind of realistically about what a truly validated target is and make sure we keep our eye on that ball.
Interesting. And, kind of going a lot to a very interesting concept, and I had a lot of requests for this, was on headcount. And I think employee headcount overall, more specifically for biotech companies. How did you at Iambic kind of think about this? I mean, as you mentioned, you come from a big clinical background. And naturally, as a company, it's very, I guess, company oriented, more financially. You have to think about this. How did you organize your I guess, your org chart at the beginning to where it is now? Who did you hire? How did you hire? I think these are very important questions.
Iambic has always been a somewhat scrappy startup company. It always feels like we've been doing a lot more than a normal company would be doing per person.
Mm,
So even now, where we're roughly 140 people, I think the number of targets that we're working on and the degree of our programs and the maturity of those programs would normally be staffed by a larger team. That doesn't mean that we're not growing. It doesn't mean that we're not, aggressively hiring
yeah,
across computational, machine learning, chemistry, and biology, and all these different fields and clinical as well. But I think that Iambic's embrace of technology has allowed us to do a lot more per person than might otherwise be the case.
interesting. So when it comes to hiring specifically, how did you kind of decide who those key first hires will be? And then how did you kind of move into, I guess, a non clinical company where now you have a different chief execs or C-suite execs that you wouldn't have in a biotech company?
Well, there's always the journey of going from just a small number of founders sitting around a table and, with big hopes and dreams to actually, creating the team that's going to be executing on that vision and reality. I think that Iambic does have some of the canonical biotech positions
Mm.
that you would expect, a head of discovery, a chief scientific officer, a chief medical officer. Those things are core, and identifying those people early on or as soon as the programs were mature enough to benefit from those people has been very important. But we have a huge fraction of the company that is, would not be appearing in a normal biotech. We have 40 to 50 machine learning and software scientists. We have, heads of machine learning that, who's absolutely world class. We have a chief technology officer that's among the co-founders. So, we have an entire technology side of the house that has been a core part of the identity of the company. And
Yeah,
just the last thing I'd say there, sorry to go on, but the last thing I'd say there is that those are not distinct things. The only reason the company works is because those two
combined.
groups of people grew together
Yeah.
in the course of making the company and embrace the kind of benefits that the other party brings in terms of helping us to ultimately use technology to make better drugs.
I think that's very interesting. Are you seeing a lot, and I've been seeing this as well, where I speak to a lot of biotech startups, and they kind of say that they're kind of integrating. They have the CTO, they're kind of going into this, obviously, this AI first environment, kind of building in that space, whether that be foundation models or more specifically developing AI for maybe a med tech solution, a medical device company, or whatever it is. Are you seeing that case being much more easier? Obviously, when you started in 2020, that was a pretty rare thing to do. Is that something that's more common now that you're seeing, like taking that combined blend?
I think that it's hard to build a company these days without an eye towards the technology future. So I do think it's more common now to have a sizable fraction of the company be kind of technology focused than might be the case 5 years ago, for example. That must be a trend. But I would also just say that, the company that you build is shaped so much by those early hires and by those people that help to, identify the direction of the team, the direction of the mission. And it's a great line of questioning because that is such a formative element of the company.
Yeah, I mean, where in the company has using AI internally actually moved specific KPI measurements that you had for your customers? And where has it, I guess, been a distraction or worse, like where you potentially were like, okay, let's use AI for this scenario, but it actually didn't really work out the way you wanted it to?
I can start with, we have many, many examples of how it moved the needle. I think the bottom line is we've been able to find medicines that we simply would not have been able to find before. And we have been able to deliver them to patients with disease at a pace that is 3 times faster than the industry average. I think there's no more important metric than that. Based not only showing that you can create drugs that are better than what people have been trying to make for decades,
Yeah.
using the old fashioned ways. To find that in record pace, years faster than would be, the typical pace of creating a subpar drug. I think that's a real measure of success and showing how, the design of the technology allowed us to prioritize the right molecules and lead to the right ultimate development candidate, is, a hugely important proof point. And then showing we can do it again and again and again. Iambic will, have 3 clinical programs we anticipate by the end of the year, and showing that it's not just a one-off success, but a repeat success that matters.
That's
Now,
so
yeah, the second part of your question was, what about the dead ends? What about the stuff that turned out to be a waste of time? And, I come from an academic background. I come from a background where you make a lot of ideas and some of them are good and some of them are not good. And, what you have to do in a startup is really be ruthless about asking, is this going to move the needle for what we're actually working on here or not? And even if it is going to move the needle, is it going to move the needle so much that it is actually working on because it's going to come at the opportunity cost of something that we won't be able to work on otherwise.
yeah.
So really just ruthlessly prioritizing those things is important and we do it all day long.
Right, and I think that goes into, how I guess the big anxiety right now about AI replacing people, and I've seen posts in which I didn't think I was gonna see since the beginning of the year about AI displacing chemists, biologists, and clinical staff members, I guess. From inside Iambic, what are you kind of seeing? Is this something that's actually gonna happen, in the next 3 to 5 years, this common displacement that people are talking about more in the biotech side of things? Or Is it just gonna be a more of an enhancing mechanism?
I think that people will definitely work differently. They're working differently already, and they will continue to work differently than they would have historically. Iambic is, of course, a company that is growing. So we are bringing in people and we are training people and we are, recruiting people that will help us build a technology focused drug development company. So I think the we do not see it as a situation where we're trying to not have staff in these different areas of expertise. We see that experience and that expertise as critical to our success. In fact, we need those people. But those people should not be wasting their time doing things that can easily be abstracted with the help of AI technologies. We need them to be thinking at a level that is on par with their unique expertise as opposed to wasting their time doing more mundane tasks that can be abstracted away with a technology solution. So we look at it that way, making people more effective in terms of their core expertise.
Yeah, and I think when I was doing my research, I saw that you guys have a key partnership with NVIDIA, and I think that was really interesting to see because a lot of biotech companies don't really involve themselves in that space. What does that partnership kind of entail with, yeah, more specifically with NVIDIA, and what are you guys kind of looking at for that long term?
Well, NVIDIA has indeed been a long term partnership. Going back to my time as a professor at Caltech, we began collaborating with them at that time. We've written multiple papers together with their engineering team and with their scientists. We've written, multiple patents together. During the course of that, we've created technologies. We've seen that they can be, and we've benefited from NVIDIA's software and machine learning team's expertise to ensure that we are scaling those technologies so that we can use them, in terms of the real world applicability of our drug discovery programs. So that's been a hugely beneficial and multi-year collaboration with them, and one that we've deeply benefited from. And you're right. Along the way, they've also become major investors in the company and strong supporters.
Yeah, and one thing, especially in biotech, you kind of work more internationally, and I wanted to get your take a lot on, I guess, the U.S. China biotech relationship. I mean, there could be a lot of potential, I guess, you know, the relationship between the US and China is very obviously very opposing. What are how are you, I guess, thinking about, Chinese capital, Chinese trial sites, and kind of these global scientific talent base, especially coming from China as Iambic scales?
Iambic is a scientifically focused company, and we are really embraceful of the many places on Earth where great science comes from, and great people come from, and great collaborative opportunities emerge. And we're always open to working with people that can help us to achieve what we want to do in a more effective way. Obviously we operate in in the environment that we do from a regulatory perspective, from a compliance perspective, and we're mindful to always use best practices in the way that we do that. But I would say that our philosophy is a very scientifically forward and
Yeah.
and collaborative stance, but we as anybody must with a company, make sure that we deploy that philosophy with all the compliance thoughtfulness.
Yeah, final couple questions before a rapid fire. I wanted to go into storytelling, and I think this is very important for a lot of biotech startups, especially because they come from the hard science route. And when they're pitching to partners, pitching to investors, it's very difficult to kind of get that correct, good storytelling about why they're starting that particular company. And I wanted to kind of start off with like how you guys started with Entos AI. That was the first kind of name, and then you guys rebranded to Iambic. What, I guess, one caused the change into Iambic, and what was your reasoning behind changing the names? And did that narrative of the name Iambic make any difference when it comes to partnership, collaborations, and investor communication and so forth?
I think that the original company name was tied to an original algorithm that my co-founder Fred Manby and I had worked on in our academic careers, and that algorithm was no longer a core part of what we were doing in the company. So the importance of that name was diminishing, I would say. And we wanted a name that would reflect the moment in terms of the importance of large language models large language, English language, Shakespeare, Iambic. That was kind of the logic for the company name switched to Iambic, and one that would be distinctive and help us to forge our identity.
So for, biotech founders that are in a small team, really don't have any clinical evidence yet, how can they actually move the needle when speaking to, sophisticated investors, whether they are biotech investors or like in your case, you have investments from Sequoia versus getting like a pass in general? Like what separates like perfectly telling a great narrative for what you're building?
Investors will immediately pattern match you to kind of who you are, right? They deal with more experienced investors and less experienced investors and more mature companies and less mature companies. And it's kind of okay to be wherever you are in that journey. You have to acknowledge what you know and stand up for what you know. You have to acknowledge the risks that, you have not yet encountered and the things that you and the company will have to navigate and be upfront about that. And you have to have a clear message for why, given what we have and what we know and who we are best positioned to win in terms of this next inflection point or to take us to that next chapter. I think it's okay to be less experienced. You just have to acknowledge where you are on the journey and be best positioned given where you are.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate this. Dude, it was amazing to have you on the show and I enjoyed this. This was a pure joy. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.